So now that we've looked at triads, let's look at the next level of chords, called seventh chords. In this lesson, we'll be talking a little bit more about intervals and specifically consonants and dissonants. So in lesson 1, we looked at the different intervals, their groups, and how to find the right size and quality of an interval. Next, in lesson 2, we looked at how those intervals came together to make the four main kinds of triads: major, minor, diminished, and augmented. But there's another kind of chord that's also extremely common in music and will be the key to your skills in composition. This is the seventh chord. So let's talk about how to make a seventh chord. When we looked at all of the different kinds of intervals, we talked about the two groups that could easily classify them, with group 1 having unisons, fourths, fifths, and octaves, and group 2 having seconds, thirds, sixths, and sevenths. We also looked at the quality of those intervals, but what we did not really touch on was dissonance. In common practice music, there are certain intervals that are considered consonant and some that are considered dissonant. So, quick definition: consonant intervals produce the impression of stability. Dissonant intervals produce the impression of tension. Now, the consonant intervals are the perfect unison, the perfect octave, the perfect fifth, and then the perfect fourth sometimes, major and minor thirds, and then major and minor sixths. When you look at these intervals, they make up a bulk of the intervals in all the triads, including their inversions. That leaves seconds, sevenths, augmented and diminished intervals, and the perfect fourth once again, which has some special circumstances. Now, augmented and diminished are obviously going to be a little tense. I mean, come on, with a name like augmented or diminished, how could they not be? But seconds and sevenths are also there, and we'll talk about fourths a little bit later. So something you'll notice is sevenths and seconds do not show up in any triads, and that's because triads are built with thirds and fifths, and also fourths and sixths if you're in an inversion. But as far as using these dissonant tones in your melodies, we'll talk about that in melody part 2 when we get in depth on scale line melodies. For now, we're just going to look at how seconds and sevenths function in harmony. So seconds and sevenths only come in when you start to use seventh chords. And if we look at a scale, it's easy to create seventh chords. You just add another third on top of the triads. So it sounds like this. That's a 1 chord, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then an octave again. The reason we call them seventh chords is because the interval between the root and the top note is a seventh. Now listen to the top note again here against the root. If I move up an inversion, so I move the root so that it's right next to the seventh, it becomes a second, and you can really hear the dissonance or the friction between the notes. Now the key to dissonance and seventh chords is that friction that you hear, it wants to resolve. It wants to move from a point of tension to a point of stability. Now listen to this example. This is a cadence. And I held that B, that leading tone, till it resolved to the 1. Now, out of all the different seventh chords, the one we are most concerned with is the dominant seventh. This chord, just as with the dominant triad, is fundamental to all music. The dominant seventh chord contains a minor seventh, in contrast to the major seventh we heard with the tonic chord. It's a little less tense. The dominant seventh is most commonly heard in cadences leading back to the 1 chord, so you hear a lot of this. So let's break it down. In C major, the dominant seventh is a major triad with another added third on top. And this third in C major is an F. It also makes the interval of a minor seventh with the root. This F has a special resolution in that it resolves directly back to the third of the tonic chord. That's that kind of quintessential amen sound. And it's when you pair this with the leading tone moving back to tonic that you get this extremely strong pull from the dominant seventh to tonic. You get this. The way we write a seventh chord is with a little 7 in the corner. So now in C minor, the dominant seventh is also a major chord, which we'll cover when we go over composing in minor keys. So just listen to this resolution so you can hear it and get used to it. Just as with triads, there are inversions. The first inversion has the third in the bass note and is written as a 5 with a little 6 and a 5 next to it. So it sounds like this. It's got the third in the bass note. This tells us that a 5 chord, this tells us that it is a 5 chord and that the notes above the bass form a third. So a third above the B is the D. But the third is assumed actually here. We tend to only put 2 numbers at a time just because it'll get a little bit unwieldy and you'll be writing a lot more numbers than you need to. After that, it also tells us that there's a 5th above the bass and then a 6th. Now the second inversion has the 5th in the bass and is written as a 5, 4, 3. So this tells us that you've got the D in the bass, then you've got an F, which is a third above it, and then you've got the G, which is a fourth above that. And then the B is just assumed. Once again, we don't like to write 3 notes, or three numbers. And then the third inversion has the 7th in the bass. So this one sounds a little bit different. You've got an F as the bass note, then you've got a 2nd above that, which is the G, then you've got a 4th above the bass note, which is a B. And then you got the D up there. Now you can have 7th chords on any scale degrees, but by far the most common is the dominant 7th. A 7th chord built off of scale degree 7 is also pretty common. This is called a half diminished 7th chord. And that's called half diminished because we're comparing it with a fully diminished, which is built off of only minor third. So minor third, minor third, minor third. Compare that to minor third, major third for the half diminished. After that, you've got 2-7, which is pretty common, 3-7, and 6-7, which are all minor 7th chords. And you've got 1-7 and 4-7, which are major 7th chords. When you start to mix up triads and 7th chords, you start to have a lot more possibilities. But we won't go into detail about all of those possibilities right now. I just want you to hear the main difference between all those different 7th chords. So let's just take a moment here to listen to each one starting on the same note so you can hear just the difference in quality. Here's a major 7th. Here's a dominant 7th. Here's a minor 7th. Here's a half diminished. Here is a fully diminished. Now here is an augmented major 7th. So it's got the major 7th between the root and then an augmented chord. And then here is an augmented minor 7th. So it's got a minor 7th between the root and the 7th. And then, of course, the minor major 7th, which a friend who is a jazz player likes to call this the spy chord. You hear it a lot doing like. For now, just stick with the dominant 7th chord in your writing. Once we move a little bit further in the course, we'll start opening up these other chords. Okay, finally, I want to go over the seventh chords for the minor harmonic scale. So 1 is a minor seventh, 2 is a half diminished seventh, 3 is a major seventh, 4 is a minor seventh, 5 is the same, it's a dominant seventh, so it's a major triad with a minor seventh on top. And then 6 is a major seventh. 7 is that fully diminished seventh chord we talked about. And once again, this is called a fully diminished because the seventh interval is a diminished seventh compared to a minor seventh. And then finally, we end on the minor seventh tonic chord. So that covers triads, seventh chords, and their inversions pretty well. Make sure you do all the exercises that go with this lesson and the previous lesson, as you want to become really familiar with all of the chords and all their inversions. In the next lesson, we're going to take a look at some chord progressions, break them down, and then use them for our own composing.